He's a child murderer. He was sentenced to life in 1988 after pleading guilty to strangling and raping 15-year-old Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth in Leicestershire in 83 and 86. Respectively. At the time of his conviction, it was believed that the paedophile would never be released, but in March of this year, the Parole Board ruled that he could be. Despite opposition from the Justice Secretary, the ruling was upheld yesterday. Pitchfork will be released in the coming days and will be subject to strict licence conditions, including probation supervision, wearing an electronic tag, taking polygraph or lie detector tests, and facing limits on his contact with children. Despite this, his release has brought great pain to the families of Lynda and Dawn. Dawn's mother, Barbara, rang us this morning and said life should mean life, while Lynda's sister, Sue Gartrick, told us, "I just pray no one else has to go through what we've had to." Pitchfork is a sexual psychopath. She said no amount of time will change him, and he now has more rights and is protected by the same laws that sent him down. Not having Lynda here is a life sentence. He should be serving one too. Leopards, she said, don't change their spots. Now, I wanted to ask the two of you. The Parole Board have gone through a process, Anne.
Yeah.
Do we respect that?
Yes. I would have been perfectly happy if Pitchfork had been hanged. I would have been perfectly happy if he'd been given a whole life tariff until he had to stay in jail until he died. Those two things didn't happen. Instead, he was given a sentence. He has served that sentence. And you cannot now, because of public outrage, 30 years later, rewrite the sentence and say, well, it should have been different. And that is why I think it is a matter for the Parole Board. It's not because I'm underestimating what the victims' relatives are going through. It really isn't. But it's got to be a matter for the Parole Board. You cannot have justice by lynch mob, and you can't have it by public outcry. I'm sorry. If the Parole Board has done the right thing, that's it. And before you say, no leopard ever changes his spots, let's remember that in the London Bridge terrorist attack, two of the people who very bravely fought off Usman Khan were convicted murderers. Let's just remember that.
So people can reform, Henry?
Redemption's possible.
They can, but I'm uncomfortable with this because I'm not sure whether each of the three R's that we think about when we sentence somebody, so we've got risk, retribution and rehabilitation. And as a former Home Office Minister, you'll be familiar with that. So with the risk, is he still a risk? Where we're told he's not. But if he's got a personality disorder and if he's a psychopath, then that risk may always be there, because with personality disorders, I don't think treatment tends to work. Retribution, okay, the 30 years or so he served. That's the retribution. Rehabilitation, again, we've got an issue with that. My concern would be the degree of supervision that the probation service would impose on him, because we've seen in cases time and again, you mentioned Usman Khan, that this hasn't worked. That would be my concern.
Would you want his identity protected? So you give him a new identity? No.
I'd be very uncomfortable with that.
Because?
Because he's only 61, right? He's not that as if he's 81 and poses no risk to minors, to teenagers, to young girls or boys. And I think people do need to be aware, do need to know, within reason, if there is a dangerous person living
Vigilante outbreaks. Vigilante outbreaks, Henry, if you do that.
So
what you're going to end up with is the police having to spend a vast amount of time protecting him, because you would have vigilante outbreaks, and that's why people are given new identities. It's not for their sake, it's for the sake of public order.
Would you give him a new identity?
If it was believed necessary, and on the risk and rehabilitation, that's why we have the Parole Board. Now, they're not going to get it right 100% of the time. No human ever gets judgment right 100% of the time. But they will know in big cases like this that they've got to be mighty careful. And there has been a review, a judge-led review, which has concluded that they acted properly. Now, as I say, I would have been quite happy if he'd stayed in prison all his life, but only if that's what he was sentenced to. You can't
I'm just
rewrite
wondering
a
whether there's an
now.
arbitrary use of the whole of life term, because there are some people who've done really unspeakable crimes and they don't get a whole of life term, and some people have done, quotes, what look like just ugly murders.
Always arbitrary. By definition, it's arbitrary, isn't it?
I mean, there's guidance. At any given time, certainly when I was prisons minister, about 24 people, but that would have included terrorists in those days, 24 people were in prison for life. Myra Hindley, Ian Brady, we can think of the people who were. And there are guidance, were the victims particularly vulnerable? Well, children always are. Was it multiple? And above all, was it premeditated? And so, as I say, no human judgment is ever perfect. But for the sake of the impartiality of the justice system, not for Pitchfork's sake, but for the impartiality of the justice system, when a sentence has been served, you cannot rewrite it.
Okay, all right.